I guess happy birthday to the Commission. It's quite the honor to sit here in front of you and the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission on such an important issue. I've heard collaboration quite a bit today, and I really thank Tim for allowing me to spend about 2 hours talking on this topic. Certainly, within about 10 minutes, I can't do it all justice, but I wanted to start with collaboration because it's been very important in what we're doing on the CAWS and on the Upper Illinois River. Of course, with our GLRI funding, but we have groups like the Council of Great Lakes Governors, and of course that represents the governors and premiers across the Great Lakes Basin, and has great things like the least wanted species list, a mutual aid agreement that allows us to help each other, and as well as initiatives that start harmonization of rules, regulations, and policies across the basin. I think very important that these are going, but all started with our invasive species work, perhaps by the ACRCC and others. We have our GLRI work, which was started by the Aquatic Nuisance Species Barrier Panel, even before the ACRCC came around in 2010. But important parts of that are the Monitoring Response Work Group, who really developed that long-term planning and monitoring and response work, as well as a technical and policy advisory group that helps us out from other technical experts. Also, we just heard from Ms. Darcy about the Glimmerous work that was birthed out of the GLRI, and of course the panel that comes out of the Great Lakes Commission. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about our Be a Hero Transport Zero, which was a GLRI funded initiative, but in Illinois we're trying to get recreational water users on board and helping prevent invasive species by messaging and branding and education. So we thank US EPA. In my role as being that Aquatic Nuisance Species Program Manager, I get to work with some really influential people, those representatives as part of the ACRCC, but also a couple groups. Dr. John Detmers from the Great Lakes Fish Commission helps co-chair the Monitoring Response Work Group, and Dr. Tammy Newcomb from Michigan is a co-chair of our AIS Task Force for the Council of Great Lakes Governors. I think we've had really good work by these groups, and I'm talking really broadly about what we're accomplishing together. The other partners, too many to name, but really all the jurisdictions around the Great Lakes, as well as those right around Chicago, are all involved on research and monitoring and really cutting edge work on how to stop Asian carp and other invasive species. If you haven't looked at Google Trends, this is kind of an interesting graph, as long as you don't compare it to Justin Bieber. But since 2006, Asian carp's been up and down, but I think what's important is since the GLRI helped work on the Asian carp issue, the development of the ACRCC, the Council of Great Lakes Governors, and other work, we see definitely a ramping up, a stepping up of our efforts in the talk on the web. So this is because of these collaborations that we've increased the level of conversation. And of course, we're talking about Asian carps. There are 4 species. We see 3 here. The silver carp, that's the jumping one. You know, perhaps without the jumping nature of that fish, we wouldn't be talking about Asian carp today. The big head carp is the one with the big head on the bottom. Us fisheries biologists are pretty straightforward. The one that eats grass is the grass carp, the third of the 4 Asian carp species. And then one that looks very similar to that is the black carp, which eats snails. And we only just have a few records of the very lowest part of the Illinois River Basin, but yet another Asian carp that we have to be concerned about. I don't need to quiz you, I don't think, or share the information. These came from southern aquaculture facilities and quickly overtook our large river systems. We can see both big head carp and silver carp enveloping the Midwest. And again, if we didn't see scenes like this, maybe people wouldn't be so excited about invasive species. Certainly, we're glad they do jump because we're talking about them today. Prior to ACRCC, we did have a group that looked at monitoring, and just below this electric barrier that Ms. Darcy talked about 30-some miles from Lake Michigan, but we monitored very heavily right below there, just typical electrofishing and gill netting. However, in 2009, a couple things changed. The carp numbers were increasing far downstream, first reproducing in the Illinois River in about 2000, but then the barrier maintenance had to occur. We had to turn off the barrier for a period of time, and we had this lack of knowledge of what was going on in an upper-river besides that ancillary monitoring. We also have a new tool called eDNA that was being applied in our rivers that said, you know, silver carp might be close to the barrier. So eDNA, I think we all know, is just capturing the water and sieving it through and looking at the gels and seeing was that DNA present or not. I think we've learned a lot about eDNA in the process, but in 2009 we were a little bit concerned. So about a $5 million rotenone was the first thing that happened just below the barrier because we had to turn it off for that maintenance. 450 people converged from all around our basin, and we were very successful to implement this in December, very cold, and even during Wisconsin deer season. The important parts were that rotenone did produce one big head carp, but in combination of that and one in next spring, we rotenone about 11% of the entire waterway with rotenone, piscicide, collecting fish, and only that one fish was found in those efforts. So in 2010, we're looking at effort above the electric barrier. We were putting lots of effort, over 12,000 person hours of work just in that short period of time, using all types of gears. And then just below the barrier, we did the rotenone effort, and we did find the one big head carp below the electric barrier. One was actually found in Lake Calumet, about 6 or 8 miles from Lake Michigan. However, all the evidence tells us that fish actually escaped some local pond. Probably never did swim up through the CAWS. But nonetheless, 2 big head carp were found above the electric barrier. Still the only 2 fish in that area after a lot more effort. And I'm going to talk about that just briefly. Because of the ACRCC and some GLRI funding, we were able to implement an Asian carp control strategy framework sponsored by US EPA and US Fish and Wildlife Service. And we developed a plan to keep Asian carp out of the waterways. And then we also published an interim summary report of what that plan's results were. So if you go to the website, you'll see both the annual plan and an interim summary report. If that's not enough detail, I do encourage you to go. We get monthly updates of what's going on. We post that for every month. Generally, however, we've got a 3-pronged approach in Illinois with our plan. One is, as we talked about, is make sure there aren't any Asian carp in the Chicago area waterways. So that was the initial focus of all of our work, make sure they aren't right below the barrier. In those first couple years, 2009, 2010, 2011, that's where we spent most of our effort. You know, that's the place where we have physical barriers. We do intense monitoring, and we had response actions. Looking at that eDNA initially, where it was being found in large numbers, we'd put crews in place trying to respond to it. Secondarily, below the electric barrier, we institute contracted commercial fishing, trying to reduce the population, as well as looking at telemetry, demographics, putting new technologies in place. And then farther downstream on the Illinois River, really long-term strategy is in this area goes beyond what we can do on a daily basis, but trying to get commercial harvest efforts to remove those populations. And I think that's a realistic goal. It's been a very adaptive management strategy, and this just does indicate the general decline in effort we spent in the CAWS because we haven't found fish, and we're very happy for that, but we've increased that level of effort directly below the electric barrier to a point where at historical levels of electrofishing as well as hoop netting and implementing other strategies. So we have removed 3.6 million pounds of fish below the electric barrier by hiring contract commercial fishers. Identifying the leading edge of approximately I-55, about 55 miles from Lake Michigan, and that hasn't changed in 9 years. Our population assessment using hydroacoustic, similar to what we do on the Great Lakes, does show that from 2012 to 2014, we've seen a 50% decline in populations on that farthest downstream reach of the upper river. We've seen a maintain of a lower population. We didn't do the study in 11, but I would argue it's probably much higher. The commercial fishing reduced the population. And in 2014, we continued to see a decline about 50% annually from those harvest efforts. The 15 numbers aren't in yet. So it was very valuable for using our commercial fishing and other mark capture technologies to talk about what are we doing to the population there. We're modeling this work? Can we predict where this removal effort is best fit? We've identified that it's actually a pretty good product, very low in mercury. We've integrated our pest management strategy with the other agencies. It's a very collaborative process, looking at contracted fishing, water guns, carbon dioxide, complex sounds, and other tools. We've looked throughout our bait, live bait dealers to make sure they're not selling small Asian carps. We're looking at urban ponds. I told you one fish was found in Lake Michigan. It probably came from an urban pond where that came in from Arkansas in catfish stockings as unintentional hitchhiker. Law enforcement is a really important part of what we're doing to make sure people aren't moving live fish throughout our state. And ultimately, we see catch rates decreasing. Ultimately, I want to skip to one more slide before I wrap up. We have novel technologies from the Fish and Wildlife Service, multiple agencies because of our GLRI funding. But perhaps this is one of the most informative slides we'll have, just kind of the status where carp are today. The red indicates basically levels where we see all parts of our life stages. We see fish smaller than 6 inches, generally talking about recruitment, and that is in the lower river. Here's Starved Rock, Lock and Dam. We call this the lower river. This has changed since 2014 from where small fish were present until today, where they actually went through Starved Rock, Lock and Dam into the lowest part of the upper river, due to 2014 and 2015 spawning, the best ever in these lower rivers. So these fish up here are, although they're 6 inches long, they're 1.5 years old. So they have had some time, and 2015 was a high water year, and the dams up there are a gated structure where those gates were out of the water for much of the spring, allowing those fish to come up. Generally small numbers, but nonetheless, they have gone farther upstream than we've seen them in the past. If you go above there into Marcel's Reach, these are the 2 reaches that we work on commercial harvests with our contracted fishers. We don't see recruitment in these areas, and we've moved those 3.6 million pounds from this area. Finally, the leading edge is right here by where I-55 crosses the Des Plaines River, and we have not seen that leading edge move. We do see occasional fish move around, especially between the Kankakee and I-55. So that's kind of generally where the fish are, and thankfully only those 2 fish in the 77 miles of Chicago area waterways. And we're always hopeful that nature has a solution for us, but we're doing our best to be informed.
Stuart's bringing up my presentation. Thank you, Kevin, and I want to thank both commissions, John, Tim, for inviting me to speak here today as well. I know we're a little bit short on time, so I'll try to keep this fairly brief. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background. Again, I'm Paul Dierking with HDR. We've been providing technical support to the Great Lakes Commission. The work over the past 5 years regarding invasive species and the CAWS. And I'm going to focus today on some of the efforts here recently, a little bit of background about the entire 5 years of work in the committee, and in particular on some of the ANS controls. You can see here the committee has a set of working criteria that starts with invasive species control and the CAWS, and then a whole other laundry list of issues that become an issue because of the potential ways for controlling invasive species in the CAWS, ranging from water quality, flood risk management, transportation, and so on, all of which are of equal importance and related within to the committee's work. Our work activities have been focused around those criteria and pieces. Talked about the control measure evaluation. I'll go into a little more detail. Done some work regarding commercial cargo navigation and maritime transportation operations. Done some consultation with US EPA, state EPA in Illinois and Indiana regarding water quality and environmental regulations. And all of those evaluations and technical work has been, as of the past 12 to 18 months, has been around this discussion framework that the committee has put together, not as a recommendation per se, but as a means for discussion and evaluation purposes. And it's predicated upon the concept of having control points in the system, as you see highlighted here. These locations could very well change, but this is the basis of the discussion as it is today. And I'll talk a little more about this, but the control points constructed together as a system create a buffer zone within the CAWS that would be used to prevent invasive species transfer. Now there's multiple pieces to this whole framework that are not just invasive species focused. It's really the first domino in the deck that would necessitate other infrastructure changes within the system. So these control points would essentially provide the means for a replumbing of the CAWS from a waterway standpoint, which would necessitate other infrastructure requirements from water quality, flood risk management, transportation. So to focus a little bit more on the ANS control measure work that we've done here recently with the Commission, I want to talk a little bit about how we looked at the controls and the information that's out there today, the existing research and information. It's primarily been focused on a particular control for a particular species. And what we try to do is aggregate that information across the range of species and across a range of controls, and to really focus on how those might apply for risk reduction. Try to frame it in the context of the risk assessments, primarily the one that was done in Glimmerous, and provide some comparisons. So I mentioned this framework that the committee is being used for evaluation and discussion. And you can see highlighted here the buffer zone with the control points as they are in today's discussion. Highlighted here by this red circle, so Brandon Road and 2 control points on the Sanitary and Ship Canal and Calsag would effectively provide controls at those 3 points, allowing for a buffer zone in between that would, in theory, be free of ANS. Would also provide additional means for monitoring and treatment should there be some type of event that would prevent the control points from being effective at the time, and would provide 2-way control within the CAWS for invasive species transfer in either direction. And one of the key points I think that's being highlighted with this approach is a phased implementation, knowing that a lot of the infrastructure requirements that would be necessary with these control points would likely take a lot of time and money. There's elements of this system that would allow for initial implementation, as Secretary Darcy talked about, Brendan Road efforts that could be used for incrementally providing additional risk reduction over time. And what our evaluation really focused on was one piece of the probability of establishment or the risk of invasive species. As you might, this is an example of a species coming from Mississippi to Great Lakes, but there's a probability of that species arriving at a system and then passing through a particular location, and then ultimately colonizing and spreading in another ecosystem. Our evaluation was really focused because we're focused on control points, and these other elements are largely fixed relative to a particular species. So we focused on the passing probability and the risk reduction that could happen at those particular points. And a lot of the discussion has been revolved around a lock system that could be put in place with ANS controls. That can take many forms. It's still an emerging concept and emerging technologies. A lot of the technologies that would be implemented are still in research and development. So again, we use best available science and information out there to try to summarize where we think things are at today. And the concepts range from electric barriers, flushing lock, treatments of various chemicals or heated water that could be put in within the lock. Now some of these controls are actually outside the lock. The water treatment would be of the water that's passing through the lock chamber itself, though the treatments might not actually occur in the lock. They may occur, off the channel, and then the water is cycled back through. But these are just some ideas and examples, and the focus of our work was to look at, again, that broad range of species and controls, recognizing that there are implications to maritime transportation that still need to be addressed and evaluated further, in particular relative to travel times, operator and vessel safety, and so on. These control ideas will vary from location to location. And so just to kind of hit the highlights of our findings for this initial work was really we saw that the efficiency is going to vary with species, as you might expect from the different control measure. And we saw a really good potential for heated water to be used. Of course, there's some feasibility issues with implementing something like that, but that in terms of control. And we're seeing things that suggest that we can get as great as 85% or greater efficiency in preventing species from moving past the point across the range of species, and as high as 95% or greater for species with redundant control points. So in parts of the system at Brandon and then at other location for the species from the Mississippi, they would pass through 2 points. That redundancy would provide an additional level of risk reduction potentially. And that so the combination of these control points really drives that cumulative effect. And I mentioned many of these technologies are still in research and development, so obviously adaptive management and ongoing investigation is going to be key to improving these efficiencies, and we feel that that's possible, and to reduce that uncertainty. And that again, our evaluation was focused on the fact that the passing probability is kind of directly correlated to risk reduction because those other elements are relatively fixed. The invasive species control part of the framework is just one part of the long-term strategy. There's other elements that I also wanted to just briefly touch on, water quality, flood risk, and transportation elements that still require additional evaluation as well for those other infrastructure investments that would be required to support these ANS control points. And then lastly, the regional and local and regional cost sharing and benefits. Still to be determined exactly how all these pieces and parts fit together in terms of where the benefit resides. Obviously there's both regional and local pieces here, and as well as where the money may come from to support these measures and initiatives. So with that, I'll turn it back over to John and Tim.
So thank you for those two presentations. I think we have a time for maybe one or two quick questions. I don't want to take a lot of time for questions right now. I want to make sure we get into the next panel, and then we can sort of take questions at the end. But if anybody has anything sort of top of mind specific to the proposals or specific to sort of where things are at this time, I'd open it up for a couple of quick clarifying questions as opposed to a long discussion, as it were. I want to make sure that we keep moving ahead with our day, but give the commission an opportunity to ask anything that's of pressing interest to them at the moment.
Thank you. Could you discuss the operating costs of the electric barriers a little bit?
Certainly, I'm not. I'd have to defer to the Corps of Engineers mostly for that. I know the electricity is often characterized as $30,000 to $40,000 a month. That's just the electric bill.
Is that per barrier or for the system as a whole?
I'd have to defer after that. I thought that was the whole shebang, all three barriers. But Corps of Engineers would be the experts on that.
Okay. I had, oh, sorry, Kate. You were done.
I'm getting yelled at by
All
the
right.
tech guy over there going. I would suggest that the Corps has a good handle on that figure, and I believe it's closer to multi-millions of dollars, and it may be that's their annual cost, but it's phenomenal.
I had one point of clarification too, Kevin, maybe about either of you. What constitutes sort of or what's the definition of the front moving? I know we've seen the slide and we've heard the language that the front has not moved for Asian carp, but yet we've seen carp 40 some miles, 51, whatever the exact number is, well downstream now. When does that definition change or kick in? What constitutes the movement of the front?
Sure. So over the last 4 years, we've put in more intense effort to look at that, to look at that leading edge. So we often characterize it as I-55 bridge because most people in the area understand where that highway goes over. It is below Brandon Road, Lock and Dam. We get several dozen of fish between Brandon Road and that I-55 bridge. We've had one lake that was a sink for fish, and we had a removal effort of about 1,000 fish in a year. However, we have telemetered fish that say when they're in that area, they may venture up, but they don't stay there. They go downstream very quickly. They don't linger. So although we know some fish will travel up to below Brandon Road, we get many more fish from I-55 downstream.
Thank you. It's still a sort of a point I'm trying to get my head around. How do we see the movements of fish yet the front is not moving, and how to sort those two things out has been a bit of a little bit confusing for me over time. Unless there's one more question, and then we're going to move on with our next panel.
All right, follow up to that question. With the sudden, or with the past 2 years movement of the juveniles upstream, what's your sense as to if that's going to cause an additional push or encouragement for the adults to move further upstream?
Very good question. Yeah, so we're designed to look at the small fish and keep a handle on the adult fish. I think we've got a reduced population up there, so we have some capacity, if you will, to absorb some of the fish. We've only seen those fish this year, the 1-year-old fish move up. Now that the river's back in control, we don't have an open gate, so it's going to be much slower. I anticipate those fish will begin to grow faster in the upper river, and we can harvest them, and they'll become hopefully part of our numbers in the next year or two. We are increasing gears such as a commercial seine. It does better on those marginal fish than the small end. I don't think there's any science that would suggest they would overcome that leading edge of adults where they are now. I can't tell you why that hasn't moved necessarily, except for our harvest. But I think they also don't like the water that's coming out of the Chicago area waterways. So that's working for us in this case. But you know, we're going to be watching very close. I guess it is a positive thing that we can look at them, we can see them and detect them in fairly low numbers. So that is positive.
Thank you, Kevin and Paul, for your comments today. A few questions from the panel, or from the commission. I'd ask you to stay kind of close at hand as we go through the next panel, and there may be some follow-up questions. I just want to make sure that we give the next panel, you know, ample time to do their presentations. Then we can kind of circle back as time allows here. So thank you.
Thank you.